السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أحييكم وأرحب فيكم من الهيئة السعودية للفضاء في أول حديث لنا من مبادرة سبيس توك، وهي مبادرة من إحدى مبادرات الهيئة السعودية للفضاء التي نسعى فيها إلى إثراء الوعي في مجال الفضاء والثقافة الفضائية، وهي مبادرة تتم تقديم حديث أو لقاء شهري مع رواد وقادة في مجال علوم الفضاء. So having said that, I would like to welcome everybody to our very first session of Space Talk in collaboration with ThinkTech. It is a monthly talk in which we will be meeting with the leaders in the space industry with the goal of promoting knowledge and culture of space within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Our first guest for today needs no introduction. His name is Charlie Bولدين. He is General Charles Bولدين, the astronaut, the previous administrator of NASA. So I won't take much longer. And Charlie, welcome to our very first ThinkTech talk or Space Talk.
Quite a pleasure being with you, my dear friend, and I look forward to the period of time that we're going to have to talk about space.
Okay, so as I mentioned, Space Talk is a monthly talk. Our first talk today will cover why space, and it will cover basically three major topics: the benefits of space science on our daily lives. We will also like to discuss a bit in terms of how space-related inventions have had an impact on our lives throughout the years. And finally, we'd like to discuss a bit the importance of space science and the space industry and shaping our future, especially in light of the commercialization of a lot of the space activities. But prior to getting into the main topics, I'd like to take about 5 minutes, Charlie. And before I say that, let me get into how we would like to cover this. We have about 45 minutes, and we have an audience of participants joining us online. We will be taking their questions online, and in the last 15 minutes of our talk, we'll be going over the questions. So I would invite everybody to participate by sending their questions via the method explained in the website. And having said that, I'll get back to our first topic, why space, and especially with an astronaut such as yourself, Charlie, I'd like to ask you why, sir, why space?
Well, Heytham, let me try to answer that in a way that may mean something to any of the Saudi youth who are looking on. I'm a person who never dreamed of going to space. I grew up in a place called Columbia, South Carolina, here in the United States. And when I was growing up, the South was segregated. So whites and blacks or people of color did not associate with each other. A place that I fell in love with through television was a place called the United States Naval Academy. And I decided that's where I wanted to go to school. So I started working very diligently to get there, and I finally did. When I left high school to go away to the Naval Academy, there were two things that I knew I would not do. And for my selection of service, I would not become a United States Marine. I thought they were a little different, and I didn't have any desire to do that. And I definitely would not fly airplanes because that was inherently dangerous. So those were the two things that I went away from home with. When I got there, I met a young Marine Corps officer who impressed me and became my lifelong mentor and friend and role model. And so I decided I was going in the Marine Corps. I found out I did not like crawling around in the mud, and I had married by then, and my wife, Jackie, insisted that, why don't we think about going to Pensacola? I said, but that's where they learn how to fly airplanes, and I don't want to fly. But I finally gave in. And we went to Pensacola. First time I got in an airplane, I fell in love with it. And one thing led to another. And NASA started selecting people for the space shuttle program. I had no interest nor any desire to apply, but for me, it was fortunate that I met the late great Dr. Ron McNair, who was selected in the first group of space shuttle astronauts. And like me, he was a young black man from South Carolina, who, unlike me, had always desired to become an astronaut. And I talked to him and was really impressed. And before he went back to Houston to continue his training, he said, hey, are you going to apply for the space program? I said, not on your life. And he said, why not? I said, they never picked me, Ron. And he looked at me and he said, you know, and young people, I want you to hear this part. He said, that is the dumbest thing I ever heard. How do you know if you don't ask? So for any Saudi young man or woman watching this today or listening in, you will never know if you don't ask. So ask for anything that you want. Study really hard, work really hard, but never, ever, ever be afraid of failure. Never, ever, ever let anybody tell you you cannot do anything. So long answer to your short question of how I got into space.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure it's very inspiring to many young folk. So coming back to the main topics of why space, we as engineers and as scientists relate to space quite differently from the general public who use space in their day-to-day activities. So from your experience across the board, from starting out as a naval aviator and then flying the shuttle, possibly, if I remember, to the highest altitude that the shuttle has been flown to, how would you say that the benefits of space science on our daily lives have become an essential part of our lives? How did space science improve our communication technology, agriculture, transportation, the quality of our lives? How do you see that progressing through your path through space?
Heytham, I think if I go all the way back to the Apollo era, because that was perhaps for the United States, that was the beginning, that was the blooming, the explosion of technology improvements and technology developments, because we were talking about sending human beings to the moon. And up until that time, all of our communications was via landline. There were no cell phones, there was no wireless way to communicate. And we knew that if we were going to put human beings 250,000 miles away from Earth, you know, that we had to be able to communicate with them. And more importantly, before we could allow the astronauts to step outside the spacecraft to the surface of the moon, we wanted to know what their vital signs were. We wanted to know about their heart rate, their blood pressure and the like. And so we came up with wireless technology, put it into the spacesuits, and that was sort of the beginning of where we are today. We look at how we kept astronauts healthy. We learned with the space shuttle program, and Prince Sultan was a friend of mine when he was in the space shuttle program, and he participated in some of the experiments that we did to help us understand how do we keep astronauts healthy on a journey, say 6 to 8 months to the moon. And we realized that we had to get ways to create an artificial gravity environment for them in which they could exercise so as to decrease bone loss and to decrease muscle atrophy. The most important muscle in the body is the heart, right here. And if you don't exercise, it gets weak just like your arms and legs. So we came up with treadmills and rowing machines and bicycle ergometers. We also improved our diet. We now have a way where astronauts on the International Space Station for 6 months at a time, at the end of each day, they download to the scientists, doctors, and nutritionists on the ground every single thing that they ate and drank that day, so that people on the ground can evaluate their physical wellness and their nutritional health. And they can send up directions the next day that says you need to increase eating a little bit of this. So we can control diet, exercise, and if need be, actually medications or pharmaceuticals to help keep them healthy. Those things all came as a result of space exploration. Not to mention the fact that when you drove into your office today, you probably had your car using GPS, Global Positioning System. Everybody over there in Saudi Arabia probably has a bank card. They go and stick their little bank card in the ATM machine. Were it not for GPS and the incredibly precise timing that comes from GPS, you wouldn't be able to get a dime out of your checking account. So those are things that we don't generally relate to space and space exploration, but they're the robotic side of space exploration that has advanced society to move the way that it has today.
So having looked into it a bit more, we can see that obviously GPS has a tremendous effect on our lives, but looking at the development of it, the history of it actually goes back all the way to you being a naval aviator goes all the way back to the Navy and the measurement of time. So the measurement of time is actually one of the things that came out of space science and was actually utilized. There's one story that I like to say, that whenever you're in Florida and you're near Cape Kennedy, the area code is 321, and it was chosen for the countdown. Now, the interesting part is most people don't know that the countdown starts when the rocket launches. So that's when we start moving a positive time. So again, time measurement and how it has affected the quality of our life is absolutely tremendous. Which leads me to, having spoken about GPS, what other space-related inventions that you see are amongst the most that have touched people's lives?
Oh, what is this? The one thing that you think that I feel is most important that's touched people's lives?
I would say, if you could say the one thing, that would be unfair, because I can think of many.
Oh yes, exactly.
So I would say, if you would think amongst the major ones that have helped, for example, in the design of spacesuits, the pumps that were used to pump the fluids were later used for the insulin pumps for diabetic individuals and whatnot. There were many things that people think of. So from your experience, having been to space and lived and worked in space, what are the things that you used up there that you still use down here?
Yeah, let me give a few examples of, and I'll try to give examples of things that we learned from our partners in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East and other places of the world outside of the United States, so that people understand that what makes us so successful today is the diversity of thought and the diversity of ideas that NASA, as an example, brings in and utilizes. Water is a critical component to life anywhere. And on the International Space Station, as an example, it's very expensive to ship water from the ground to the International Space Station. So we want to ideally be able to produce our own water on orbit. We have studied the way that you all do desalination, the way that you do other water purification processes, and we have adapted those to life on the International Space Station, such that today we actually collect and recycle about 98% of all the liquid products that are produced, whether it's urine, perspiration, condensate, from exercises and the like, and we clean it up and recycle it, so that we like to say yesterday's coffee is tomorrow's fresh water, because we've gotten to the point that we can do that today. If you look at arid climates, and everywhere in the world is becoming an arid climate nowadays because of global warming and climate change, we look at ways to grow crops in areas that have limited amounts of water. So on the International Space Station, we're now able to grow, say, cherry tomatoes or beans, cabbage, lettuce, green leafy vegetables, because we've learned how to do a process called hydroponics, where we spray water on the roots of the plants that we want to grow, so that we can grow plants the same way we do down here on Earth, with just a little bit of tweaking to the technology. One of my favorites, however, and because I actually had an opportunity to tour a number of the research institutes and big hospitals there in Saudi Arabia on my last trip there, is something as simple as ultrasound, where we want to know the health of a fetus as a mother is carrying her child. It used to be that a woman had to come all the way into a hospital to be put into an ultrasound machine. That day is long gone. Because of the necessity to be able to do ultrasound on astronauts, we now have a machine that, or an ultrasound sensor that's about the size of my cup here, that each astronaut can hold, and they can either do it on themselves or they can do it on a fellow astronaut. That technology, that miniaturized technology, is now used in the United States and in countries all around the world in rural areas, so that doctors 100 or 200 kilometers away can actually look at a fetus that a midwife or someone else is helping to show them with an ultrasound machine and give advice to a mother as to whether or not they need to get in a car or get in a cart or get in something and get to a doctor that may be hundreds of kilometers away. So just a few examples of some of my favorites anyway.
Now, with so many inventions that have trickled down from the space industry into our daily lives, we can actually see that, and this has led to an increase in the commercial sector coming into play within the space sector. We noticed within the US, for example, the commercialization of the human spaceflight, companies coming into play to transport the astronauts to and from Earth to the space station and to other, hopefully, future destinations, be it the moon or further. Now, in terms of the commercialization of space, do you see that it was the space science itself that led to basically the huge impact that we have had, or is it the other way around, in which the commercialization of space right now is bringing a more tangible sense to space to the common folk?
Heytham, I think it's actually a combination of the two. I think it started out that space science gave us the capability, space science and technology gave us the capability to produce less expensive, more accessible spacecraft that could get humans to space, which then opened the aperture, if you will, of people who began to think about taking people to space. It was no longer just governments and government organizations. You had companies here in the United States like SpaceX or Blue Origin or Virgin Galactic, all of whom have been in the news quite a bit here in the States of late. But it's the presence or the availability of the commercial capability to get people to space that has caused space science to actually explode in our capabilities. Because now that we can get more people who are non-government astronauts or non-government scientists and engineers to space to do research, the fields are growing dramatically. And I think that's only going to increase. You know, you and I have worked, for example, in talking about the future of the Saudi Space Commission. If you look at what I hope will come out soon, their strategic plan and their vision and mission, you're going to find that in Saudi Arabia, it will be possible for men and women who are in the research community from some of the research facilities there in Saudi Arabia to go to space to do their own experiments. They don't have to ship them to the United States or to Europe or to Russia or anywhere else. We can actually get them on a spacecraft where they can do their own experiments, whether they stay for a week or a month or a year. That's well within our reach right now, largely due to a lot of the work that you've been doing.
So this definitely asks the question, the necessity of humans going to space as opposed to robotic missions. Why should we persist on launching humans to space, to microgravity and beyond, where we have developed enough capacity within artificial intelligence to possibly be able to do that more safely?
I'm not sure that I would agree that we're able to do the space flight safer by use of AI and robotic systems. If you're talking about human safety, yes, because as they say, the safest way for a sailor to remain safe is not to go to sea. The safest way for an astronaut to remain safe is not to go to space. So when we send a robotic spacecraft, we're not sending humans and we call it safe. We have accidents with robotic spacecraft also. So if you want to attach a robotic life to that spacecraft, it's not safe for them either. And the other thing is that there are certain things that this thing here, the human brain, can do much better than any computer that we know today. Computers have gained a reputation for being faster in many respects than the human brain, but they still today, as far as I know, we don't have computers and AI systems that can think rationally, that can make decisions. For example, a lot of my science friends, my geology friends tell me that if we had had a human being, one astronaut on the surface of Mars, as long as, you know, as we've had our 2 Mars rovers now, Curiosity and its sister ship, we would have explored half of the Martian surface by now, because
how technology has been able at least to maintain us working together, just as we're doing right now, having this virtual meeting. But how do you see the next generation of space science and technologies being developed and shaping our future?
I think, as you mentioned, and as we saw, as we continue to see throughout our battle with COVID, that the space industry has demonstrated its adaptability, such that we have taken some of our space companies we've been able to take a portion of their physical assets and turn them to the production of assets that we needed, things like personal protective equipment, something as simple as masks and the like, so that we could speed up or develop more masks at a more rapid pace. And a lot of that has come from formerly companies that were considered to be space technology companies, or making ventilators or the like. So we've demonstrated that. We've also seen the pharmaceuticals industry, because of the research that has been going on both here on Earth and in space. As far back as just the space shuttle era, we were beginning to look at gene studies, and then we finally got around on the International Space Station to where we can actually do gene sequencing on orbit that helps us under things like gene sequencing, looking at protein crystal growth, where we grow microscopic crystals that are very perfect protein crystals that we can bring back to Earth to allow scientists in the laboratory to slice and dice those protein crystals to take a look at what their structure is like, such that we can make pharmaceuticals, or we can make antibiotics or antiviral drugs that can combat the particular bad agent that we happen to have grown the crystal of. So those kinds of things, space brings us an incredible benefit to solving problems that we encounter here on Earth and have really had a difficult time understanding for many decades.
I'd like to bring the discussion a little back to human spaceflight again, looking at how commercialization is shaping the future of human spaceflight, but also, as you mentioned, some of the companies a few minutes ago that were in the news, such as Virgin Galactic and their upcoming flight. How do you see people having more access to space? Is it solely going to be through space tourism, or will we actually be looking at future space hotels? Where do we see the role of humans in space and in shaping the future of space?
My hope, Heytham, is all of the above. We have a company that has had a module attached to the International Space Station now for in excess of 5 years, called Bigelow Space. When they first went up, we were kind of hoping that Bigelow, because he's a hotel magnate, we were hoping, and he had said in his vision that what he wanted to do was demonstrate the capability of his modules to, to survive in space and to sustain life, because he wanted hotels on orbit, and he actually wanted to be able to take some of them constructed on orbit or inflated, not inflated or built on orbit, to take down to the surface of the moon to become lunar habitats. That hasn't quite developed the way that he envisioned, but I'm still hopeful that that will happen. We have other companies that are doing like things. But I think most importantly, in addition, or actually that I think will exceed space tourism, will actually be the utilization of space, particularly low Earth orbit, for companies and individuals, academia, entrepreneurs, to do testing, evaluation, research in the microgravity environment of low Earth orbit for things that they could not do or couldn't do as well down here on Earth. So my hope is that while we will see space tourism, that will not be the main involvement of humans with space, but it will be one of the ways that humans get involved, but the bulk will be in human presence in low Earth orbit to do research and experimentation.
So then how would you see the future of that happening with the, when we look at the lifespan of the International Space Station and its projected ongoing extensions? So best thoughts are possibly a few more years of life. We read in the news that a big part of the US lab is being commercialized by NASA as well for access on the ISS. So how do you see that, say, beyond the retirement of the ISS? How can we maintain and continue human presence in low Earth orbit for scientific purposes?
The way that we intend to do it, and the way that's the long-range plan, is to have commercial companies, several of whom you are very familiar with, whether it's Axiom or Nanorex, Made in Space, some of the others, to actually construct modules that have a capability of sustaining life for human beings to replace the International Space Station. Right now, it's I think it's been approved by the US Congress to 2024, with expectations that will be approved to go to 2028. From an engineering perspective, many of us believe that 2028 is probably the end of the road, although the Boeing Corporation and several others say they think they can stretch it to 2030. But the critically important thing for us will be to take some of these commercial companies, let them put their own modules on the station to demonstrate their capability, and then detach them and let them become standalone modules that we can rely on to transition our work from the International Space Station to these commercial modules in low Earth orbit, in a variety of orbits. It's important to understand that today, the International Space Station orbits Earth at about 52 degrees inclination. And for your audience, to help them understand, if this is the equator, when we talk about orbital inclination, it's the angle at which the spacecraft crosses our equator. The International Space Station crosses the equator at a pretty high angle. It's about 52 or so degrees. And it's really hard to get there, say, from the launch site in the United States. The Kennedy Space Center, for example, Cape Canaveral and even Vandenberg are roughly 20, 30 degrees north latitude, which means if they just do a normal launch without exercising any excess energy, they'll go into a 28, 30 degree inclination orbit, which will never reach the International Space Station. So we take a good bit of energy to crank the vehicle around off the launch pad and get it adjusted into a higher inclination orbit. There are three things that we can do when we go, three capabilities that we can fulfill when we go to space. We can take a lot of weight, we can go to a higher inclination orbit, or we can go to a higher altitude. You can't do all three unless you have some monstrous vehicle. So we take quite a bit of our assets to crank the vehicles around to get them to the 52 degree inclination orbit. Fortunately, space station's at about 400 kilometers in altitude. So that's a relatively easy altitude to reach. So you don't sacrifice anything. You mentioned earlier that my flight with the Hubble Space Telescope, we went to the highest altitude in a circular orbit that humans have been then or since. But that was because we were trying to get Hubble to the highest altitude we could. It's in a 28.5 degree inclination orbit. So we just launched and headed due east out of the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. And we took advantage of the excess energy in that case to take Hubble to the highest altitude we could and still come home. So one of those three you can choose. It's hard to get all three.
Clearly, looking at the things related in getting things up to space, and looking now at the technologies being developed, especially by commercial companies, for the reusability of rockets. I think that is one of the key things that will help drive the future of space technology and the space economy, especially in terms of looking at a very polluted low Earth orbit. So again, coming back to the presence of humans in low Earth orbit in such a hazardous, polluted environment with space debris becoming rather an issue, how would we be able to answer a question like that?
We actually have some companies today. Unfortunately, governments are generally not expending funds to do orbital debris removal, although you're starting to see the US Space Force, NASA, NOAA, and some other government agencies here in the US, as well as the European Space Agency, start to talk about it. But I think it's going to actually be entrepreneurs, the private sector, academia, that are going to devote time and effort to developing spacecraft or some type of spacefaring, space-going vehicle that can help us to collect and deorbit the debris that's beginning to just completely wipe out low Earth orbit. The other thing that we really need to be very careful about, space is a war-fighting domain, and I think everybody understands what we mean when we talk about warfighting. Any place where human beings, this is my opinion, Heytham, okay? So hopefully your audience will understand this. This is not any policy or anything, but my opinion is wherever human beings happen to be becomes a warfighting domain, because some of us just like that, and some of us have a hard time of putting warfighting out of our brains as a way to solve problems. Everybody's not a person who believes in engagement the way that you and I do. But space, because human beings we now proliferate space, space has become a warfighting domain. We have to remember, however, that what is different about space from Earth is it cannot tolerate the proliferation of debris, of particles, because they will damage, they will destroy vehicles that are trying to operate in that environment. We shoot a vehicle with a kinetic weapon here on Earth, it falls to the ground, and we just step right over it. You shoot a vehicle in space, in low Earth orbit, with a kinetic weapon, and it just breaks up into thousands of pieces that will stay in that orbit for hundreds of years. And the more and more we put pieces of debris out there, the much more difficult and risky it's going to be to put humans safely into those orbits. So the use of kinetic weapons in orbit is something that we must jealously guard against, or it's going to make it unsustainable for anyone to operate in that environment.
I believe in terms of looking at space, I personally tend to think of space as a unifying place that brings nations together. We all know the story of the Apollo-Soyuz mission back during the Cold War, and how space was able to bring nations together. So not looking at the, let's say, negative aspects of how we can try to govern and police space without the use of kinetic weapons, I would rather focus on looking at legislation, looking at development of best practices in terms of, especially with the commercial sector getting more involved now, is into looking at the lifespan of the satellites, looking at how we can then look at deorbiting them if they're in LEO, or placing them in a graveyard orbit, say if they're beyond GEO, etc. So all of these, I would think, are things that, as you said, nations don't look at, and it would probably take entrepreneurs looking into it to be more in touch with developing it on a fast-track basis. But
Yes.
it's also those entrepreneurs that are adding to the problem with launches of multiple satellites, such as these low Earth communication satellites, without naming any of the ones being developed. But those themselves have already, as I believe and as I read, have caused interference, especially within the astronomy community.
Exactly. I think you're absolutely correct.
So, Charlie, I think we've covered pretty much the three topics in terms of the benefits of space science on our daily lives, and in terms of how space science helped improve communication, technology, and the quality of our lives. We also touched a bit on the space-related inventions. We had a slight discussion in terms of what we think were the most relevant and most impactful on our lives, and the importance of space and commercialization of space activities in light of both robotic and human space activities. I'd like to thank you, Charlie, for your time, and I'd like to open the floor to questions that we have received from the attendants.
And Heytham, for the information of your audience, I've been trying to answer some of the questions online in the Q&A section. So as fast as I can type and listen to you.
You work much more faster than I do, sir. So we have a question here that says, do you think that NASA will actually be able to return to the moon and achieve its goal of having boots on the moon in 2024?
I do not. I think 2024 is, and now again, remember now, this is an opinion of one. I think 2024 is a tall order. That's right now, that's essentially 2 years from now, 3 years if you want to say by the 31st of December, 2024. But I think to do it safely and efficiently, working with our international partners and with the commercial sector, it's going to come, but I think it's more likely to happen toward the end of the decade, you know, sometime after 2025, 2026. And I think most of the spacefaring nations of the world, the big ones anyway, Russia, China, the US, most of us, at least a couple of years ago, projected that it would probably be 2028 or so by the time we got back to the surface of the moon. And I think, if I remember correctly, I think that's the Chinese target, and I'm not sure whether the Russians even talk about independently putting someone on the surface of the moon anymore.
Great. Another question is, what would you think are the main objectives that NASA is trying to achieve in its space exploration currently?
I think NASA's #1 objective in space exploration today is to try to answer the question, is there life elsewhere? Almost all of our robotic exploration of Mars to date has been in trying to determine whether there is life there. We've now bored into the surface, we've found water, we've done everything. The next thing for us to do is put humans on the surface to take an up close personal look to help us determine whether there's life there as we think. Some of you who are big space enthusiasts will know that just this year, NASA and other spacefaring nations have revised their estimates about Venus. And NASA, for example, has 2 missions now slated to go to Venus later in this decade, and they are searching for signs of life on Venus. Not that we believe humans can live there, because we really still hold pretty strongly to the fact that Venus is way too hot and way too toxic. But it would be incredible if we can find that life in some form is able to survive in that type of toxic environment.
Right. We have another question here, which is quite interesting. It mentions talent. So we've spoken about engineering talent, the science required in being able to do these amazing missions. But what would your advice be to somebody that would look at it from a literary point of view? What talent are required in story making and conveying this to the people, to the non-technical folk, if you'd like?
This question is one that I am so glad has been asked, because it's something that I try to harp all the time. I don't use everybody knows what the term STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math means. I don't use that term anymore. I use STEM plus AD, which is STEM plus arts and design, because we feel, based on our experience with NASA, that among the most important assets, human assets we can have, are people who can speak the spoken word, convey communications to people in a manner that they can understand, so that they fully grasp what it is that NASA is trying to do. So the field of communications, whether it's written, television, social media, you name it, we hire people who are proficient in those areas every single day. We're always looking to expand that group of people. Storytellers, people who can write books, who can make movies, who can make television programs that help the normal person here on Earth understand the critical importance of people going to space. Going back to one of the questions you asked me earlier, why send humans when robots can do just as well? Well, robots don't do just as well as humans. It's essential that we send humans to close out the work that robots have begun. And we really need storytellers who can help us explain that to ordinary people. I would tell you, it's not unlike trying to convince people to take the COVID vaccine. Some of us who are scientifically bent, we don't know how to talk to people about the critical importance of getting vaccinated, whereas storytellers can give them things that are much more meaningful to the average man and woman on the street, and may help us to help them understand the critical importance of becoming vaccinated, so we can really cut down the possibility of this dreaded disease ravishing humanity as we know it.
Which brings me to the next question, which actually talks about the collaboration between humans and robots. So the question is, do you think in the future that the collaboration between robotics and humans will actually lead to further integration and reach a level of what we see in science fiction these days?
I think undoubtedly, when we collaborate with robots, and everybody has heard the term AI, or artificial intelligence, that is perhaps the best collaboration between humans and robots, or robotic systems today, in that artificial intelligence has the ability. Remember, I talked earlier about the fact that computers can generally do things quicker than the human brain, but they don't yet have an ability to reason and do some things that robots are not able to do. But AI gives us the capability of taking massive amounts of data and synthesizing that data so that it can cut down on what the human has to actually look through to come to decisions. Artificial intelligence doesn't, as a general rule, make decisions for us. What it does is it presents information in a much more honed down way, so that we can make critical decisions in a much more timely manner, because we didn't have to go through the reams of data that allowed us to get the information needed to make the decision. I hope that explanation helps people.
The next question I have here is, do we expect space tourism in the near future, within the next 5 years? And in what fashion and manner do you expect to be a space tourist? And you being an astronaut, would you go as a space tourist?
Great question. I don't want to go as a space tourist, because I've toured. I want to go and be productive on orbit. John Glenn, it was the late Senator John Glenn is my hero, because he flew at the age of 77. So Wally Funk will fly here hopefully will fly with with Bezos on his New Shepard flight coming up a little less than a month from now. So I'm trying to remember how old Wally is, but I think she may eclipse John Glenn. I think she's in her 80s, and that would, but Senator Glenn and I used to talk about my return to space, and he told me he encouraged it strongly as long as I did not fly before I was at least 77, because we need more data points from the generic population. So I would want to go back and at least try to be as productive as John Glenn was on his flight. His crew said he was an animal, said that he did experiments better than other people. He was in great shape. And so they respected him for being there because he was a contributing crew member. And I think that's what's most important for most people. And I hate seeing it where people think that the people who are flying on the commercial vehicles today are just wealthy people looking to go out for a joyride. I think the most of them about whom I've read are looking for much more than a joyride. They're looking to be able to contribute something to humanity. Whether you're talking about Sir Richard Branson or Jeff Bezos, all of them have experiments that they plan to do over the period of time that they're in space, and they're experiments that will help us answer some questions that have long been asked. And I think people who have the capability of doing it should do it at every opportunity.
Bringing us to a question, you mentioned going to Mars, probably going to Venus, searching for the question, is there life beyond planet Earth? So the question is, why are most countries focusing their missions to the planet Mars?
My belief is the reason we have chosen Mars is because the science and scientific exploration tells us that Mars, billions of years ago, was much like Earth. It had a temperate climate, lots of water. It was like a mini Earth, and it presented an environment that was perfect to sustain life as we know it. Something happened. Its magneto in the core of the planet was turned off or failed or whatever you want to say, and so it no longer has a magnetosphere like Earth to protect it from being bombarded by radiation, which is gradually scraping away its atmosphere. But still, we believe that Mars harbors all kinds of signs of life, if not life itself. So that's the one planet in our solar system that we believe we are most likely to find signs of life in an environment that humans may be able to survive in, given protective equipment and a habitat that I think will be subterranean to protect it against excessive radiation. So that's the primary driver for going to Mars.
So the question on my screen right now is with regards to, again, the low Earth orbit and it getting too crowded with essentially multiple launches by multiple nations. We read in the news a few weeks ago about the basically the re-entry of the Chinese rocket back into orbit and it being an uncontrolled re-entry. Is this something that we should worry about more as launches are becoming more increasing?
It is something that we should be concerned about. I would not say we should worry. The Chinese know as well as anyone else what international conventions are today, and international conventions demand, they can't require because they're not law, but they demand that any nation or any entity that sends something to space provide enough fuel on it to either safely deorbit it into a harmless return, burn up during reentry, and then whatever remnants are left fall into the ocean harmlessly, or be moved to a higher what we call a parking orbit that will leave it there for hundreds of years so that it's out of the way of other orbiting spacecraft, and particularly unable to come back and damage things on Earth. So I think that's something that we must keep in mind, and every entity that sends something to space must try to adhere to that convention. So the Chinese sort of gave us a wake-up call in that even they, who knew what the convention was, managed to find that they had a vehicle that they could not control and represented a threat to the planet and people on it.
So I have a few questions here that are all somewhat related. One essentially talks about in order to become an astronaut, what would be the major specializations that they should get into? But I think you answered that when you said STEM plus AD.
Yes.
So more precisely, focusing again on the science behind becoming an astronaut. You mentioned the trip of His Royal Highness Prince Salman H5 and how he participated in many experiments that have promoted the well-being of astronauts. How do you see human ability to work and live longer in space develop since essentially the past few decades?
If I understand the question correctly, I think that what we have done is we have managed to find ways to educate people from non-technical areas, non-STEM related areas. We've found a way to educate them to the risk of space flight, to be able to teach them what they need to know about the few technical things about their spacecraft in which they're going to fly, such that they can be a contributing crew member while also performing their primary mission of working in their particular chosen field, whether it's entertainment or art or writing or whatever else. And I think you're going to see over the coming months and years, more and more people who are contributing to space flight through the arts and design, but who are also contributing crew members because they can do the standard tasks, like, for example, cleaning, running a vacuum cleaner, doing the mundane things that have to be done as a member of a space crew. If you talk to Prince Sultan, he may be royalty, but he had a job to do on the space shuttle doing his STS-51G mission, just like everybody else on the crew. So, cleaning the toilet when it was time, cleaning the filters and stuff, because that was a part of the crew's life, and preparing food, by the way. So he's probably a much better dad and husband around the home, although he won't, he can't go out around Saudi society and do those mundane things. But around the house, my guess is the family says, okay, no excuse. We know you did it because you were in space as a member of your crew. So you'll do it here in the house.
Coming back to a question regarding space tourism, this is a question that looks into the selection process of space tourists. Obviously, currently the methodologies used to launch humans into and will that allow, again, no age restriction on future astronauts?
Both questions, I think the answer is yes, but let me amplify it a little bit. When you watch, those of you who have an opportunity to watch Virgin Galactic with their flight tomorrow, when they launch their spacecraft from the White Knight, from the carrier aircraft, that's an example of flying into space, where you're not on a launch pad. You don't have to go through the violent shaking and rattling of ascent, of igniting rocket motors and the like. They simply are dropped from an aircraft already flying, and they accelerate using rockets on board to be able to kind of climb into space and then come back down. So we're looking at what we call single stage to orbit capabilities of launching from a runway and getting to the speeds that you need. The limitation on that is ability to absorb heat and withstand the heat of flying through our atmosphere at incredibly fast speeds. We're not quite there yet. What Virgin Galactic does is they get up into the upper reaches of the atmosphere where it's very thin, so they don't go through the kind of heating that a spacecraft would go through if you launched it from a runway. The second part of the question, if I remember it correctly, is yes. You know, we are going to find ways to get normal human beings into space and help them adjust and adapt, such that it does become routine is a word I hate, because there is nothing routine about space flight, but I think we'll figure out a way to get it done.
Great. One other question I have, and then one final question. When you mentioned that there are major roles, so what are the roles of scientists basically, and then the design of the mission, let alone the engineers, but the actual scientists, the life scientists, and the remaining members?
Heytham, I think you will remember from some of the work that you and I did together with some of the research hospitals, research centers there in Saudi Arabia. The people who were primarily focused on designing the mission were, in fact, the Saudi doctors and researchers who knew what it was they wanted to study, whether it was gene. In fact, there were some of them who were looking at gene sequencing for gene therapy and the like, or people looking at how do we deal with handicaps. And I hate that word, but people who have difficulty either moving around or doing other normal, what we consider to be normal human functions. So they were primarily involved in designing the mission that would be flown in low Earth orbit, whether it's on a commercial vehicle or on the International Space Station or wherever. So there are already entities there in Saudi Arabia who know how to do this and who have in fact done it, and they're just waiting for the opportunity to take those experiments to space. And that's where you know, I encourage Saudi Arabia to work with the Saudi Space Commission and the government to find ways to, you know, to fund Saudis flying to space to do experiments and research, just as in the past we have given it over to other government agencies like NASA to fly it for them, but to fly it themselves.
Great. So our final question, which I kept as our last question, is: do you have a favorite book? And is there a book that you can think of that would help shed more light and make people more enthusiastic about space?
Interestingly, I tried to answer this question earlier. My favorite book, believe it or not, is The Martian. And I know people may say, oh, everybody knows that. But the reason I love the book and the movie is because the author of the book and the production crew, the producer and director of The Martian, were so intent on trying to ensure that everything in the movie and the book were technically and scientifically accurate. So while they may have been science fiction products, they were really, really factual. And if you look at the work that's going on the surface of Mars today, with the rovers and with the Ingenuity helicopter and the like, these are all things that were science fiction a few years ago, and today are becoming science fact. A lot of the things that that were done in The Martian, the book and the movie, are things that we are currently doing on the surface of Mars, whether it be through looking at ways to take carbon dioxide out of the Martian atmosphere and dissociate it into breathable oxygen and oxygen for propellant, those kinds of things, getting methane out of the Martian soil. Those are all things that were done in the movie and the book, and they were done because they knew that NASA and our sister agencies and private partners were looking at those as technologies that we needed to perfect in an area that we call in situ resource development and utilization, or ways that we go to a particular place like Mars and take the resources that we find there to utilize to do the things that we know we need to do. Rather than taking fuel for a rocket, we get it from the soil or from the atmosphere of that particular planet to make our trip easier to do.
Great. Well, thank you so much, General Charles Bولدين, for being our first speaker at Space Talk. Again, I'd also like to thank the audience and their participation in the questions. أود أن أشكر الجميع للمشاركة في مبادرة سبيس توك، المبادرة المقدمة من الهيئة السعودية للفضاء لإثراء الثقافة الفضائية بالتعاون مع Think Tech. نشكركم جميعا. Thank you, Charles.
May I say thank you to you, first of all, for being the brainchild behind this, but most importantly to your audience. I've had an opportunity to read their questions and read what's going on in the chat. Your audience is incredibly well informed, and their questions were wonderful. So thanks to the audience, and thanks to you for making this a really fun session for me. I wish we could do it longer, and I look forward to my next visit in person to the kingdom.
I look forward to welcoming you to Saudi Arabia next time you're here. Thank you very much, sir, and thank you, everybody.